Shall we move on? You want to talk about revenue, no?
I do want to talk about revenue
Now,
because
this is all you, Jesse. This is all you. You wanted to talk about this. You said, "Can I talk about this?" And I said, "You can talk about it. Go for it."
So I stumbled across a very interesting graph on X during the week, and that was each club's revenue, sans pokies revenue, for season 2023. Now, a couple of qualifiers here. Yes, revenue does not equal profit. I did graduate year 5, and also we will explain the context of what a lot of this means. Now, of note to me, the club with the most revenue sans pokies in season 2023 was West Coast, who cleared 70 million. Second was Collingwood. Third was Fremantle. Let's hit pause there.
Okay.
You have the biggest club in the AFL in Collingwood, and I don't think that's an unfair comment.
Nope.
They've got a massive history, enormous fan base. They will bring 90,000 to a game at the G if that game is worthy of 90,000 people showing up. They're a massive club.
Mm-hmm.
Of the Victorian sides, they're the biggest club in the competition.
Sure.
That's not to say that Carlton, Essendon, and Richmond are not massive clubs themselves, but Collingwood are that star atop the tree in Victoria. Look who bookends them, though. It's the two West Australian clubs who, in a lot of ways, don't get a lot of things go their way. I mean, Fremantle had to fly to Melbourne, and this is not a swear word, Spotify, don't do anything, on a Fokker 100.
Yeah.
Fokker with an O.
Barker.
And 2 Ks.
Mm-hmm.
Too close, Liam. But just bringing back from that, this got me thinking about a lot of the commentary around Team 20, and I'll talk more about that in a second more broadly, but also WA3, because that has been coming up a lot more in the last month than certainly I can recall it coming up in the last 20 years. The WA Football Commission do not want it on the basis that, and I cannot believe they likened it to a Melbourne versus North Melbourne scenario. Great drive-by on North Melbourne WAFC. that is an absolute slap with the whip. Very clearly said they don't want it on the basis that a third club would essentially struggle to sell out Optus.
Yeah.
Which I think in many ways is true. Certainly not straight away. You know, you got to remember, Fremantle have taken 30 years to build up a membership base of 60,000, to build up getting 54,000 on a Friday night against Collingwood. You know, it's a massive undertaking to come in as second or third in line without the suburban historical roots that the VFL have. Like you look at Victorian clubs specifically. Collingwood, Western Bulldogs, Footscray, North Melbourne, they're historically working class suburbs. Then you look more broadly at places like Hawthorn, they've got their working class roots. St Kilda, they've got their own individual tapestry, but it was very suburban based, and your suburb was your identity, and your identity was your football club. Mm-hmm. That's not the world anymore. You know, we are a diverse society. We don't have that as much, that working class divide between suburbs anymore. Like where I live now, I'm sure there are people quite well off. I'm sure there are people probably doing it tough. It's just a suburb. Like there isn't that divide anymore, so that you don't have that historical base that you then build generations through of, I am from Beaumaris, therefore I'm a St Kilda supporter, or I'm from Seddon, I'm working on the docks, I support Footscray. There's not that historical context anymore. Mm-hmm. So then you have to find unique identities for other clubs, and a lot of that is going to have to be state-based, which is, I guess, a macro take of that suburban identity. I'm from Tasmania. I'm from Gold Coast. I know there's 2, but just go with it. I'm from the west of Sydney. I don't identify with the east of Sydney. That divide is probably bigger than you're going to have in WA. That west-east divide in Sydney, because Sydney has its complex housing, population, growth issues. That divide is probably more prevalent than it is in Melbourne nowadays, than it is in Perth. There's not that kind of, I don't want to say wrong side of the tracks because that's quite, sneeringly classist, but certainly based on historical terms, that's what you would describe it as. There's that divide between West and East. Mm. Now, to me, WA3 only serves one purpose, and that's dilution of the Western Australian football market. Now, we're not going to jump ship, Liam. I certainly don't think I'm not. I don't think you are.
Not a chance.
Fremantle and West Coast fans, by and large, are the most passionate fans in the country. That's why when the membership renewal comes every year, it gets paid. That's why West Coast have a wait list to even get a season ticket to go to their games.
Mm-hmm.
While I accept the argument that a few of those waitlisters may be inclined to go and get a membership at the new football club, I don't necessarily disagree with that. By and large, WA is sorted. You come to WA, and Liam, you could probably talk about this as well because you have moved around a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But when you come to WA, you essentially got to pick one. It's set out as like a or in Western Australia that you have to pick Dockers or Eagles. And even not following football isn't an excuse. You still have to pick one.
Yep. I mean, my Robbo, who comes to the games with us every week, he's from Manchester. He moved to WA. I took him around down to Margaret River one time when he first visited here, when he was about to move out, and we were having a few wines, and Hawthorn were playing Essendon on the telebox, and we were watching it. He's like, oh, this Hawthorn team looks pretty good. And I smacked him across the back of the head and I said, absolutely not. If you're living in this side of the country, you have to pick one of our teams. And because I picked up your Manchester City team, you must pick the Dockers. Didn't give much of a choice. But if he'd selected the Hawks, I would have been very, very upset because it would have been sacrilege. Moving to WA and selecting the Hawks, no. Absolutely not. I'd rather he picked the Eagles than the Hawks.
Yeah, I agree. I think he probably would rather have picked Eagles than Fremantle in hindsight too.
No. See, he's a Manchester City supporter. He knows the struggles. They struggled for so long and they finally got to the top. He needs to write it out. He'll be fine.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
We all need to write it out. But I think that goes to strengthen my point, though, is that there is a very clear divide between Eagles, West Coast. But again, Eagles, Fremantle. But again, you ask a lot of West Australian fans, who would you rather win? And I'm not going to dump on Collingwood here, but who would you rather win a premiership, West Coast or Collingwood? To another Fremantle fan, a not insignificant amount say West Coast. And I've asked plenty of Eagles fans who would you rather win a premiership, Fremantle or Collingwood. A not insignificant amount say Fremantle. Mm-hmm. Now, although there is that strong divide, there's a bigger divide than that, and that's the Kalgoorlie line. And that is anything east of that, don't want a bar of it.
Mm-hmm.
So WA3 could work if there was very clear expectations set. As in, you're not playing at Optus. You need your own 20,000 seat stadium because you're not going to be able to play Optus. Subiaco was okay at the start because I think it was about 25 when we came in and eventually renovated up to about 40. That works. But it's going to look like a St Kilda game every second week in Perth if WA3 comes in. There's going to be no one there.
Yeah.
So I think it only serves to dilute Western Australia's ever-growing revenue. And I would love to see the two clubs, as they have done in recent weeks to an extent, unite and start advocating for WA getting a fairer shake of the stick when it comes to many equalisation measures that simply make it harder and harder and harder for Western Australian teams to retain talent and ultimately to compete.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you've heard, Jesse, but apparently there is no unfair advantage for West Australians. They've decided over there, so not a problem. We move on, and to other things. Not the next topic. I'm saying from giving WA WA teams any sort of more benefits because we don't need them. I've forgotten that already. They've decreed. The Victorians have decreed.
Roll decree from Andrew. Now look, we'll stop complaining bitterly about being Western Australian here. I do want to move on though within the topic of revenues to the other end, and they are the battlers. So Gold Coast GWS, they bring it up. No, again, I don't think that's going to be a shock to anyone, and I don't necessarily mind the AFL essentially supporting those clubs financially because I'm not short-sighted enough to not see the benefit in having teams for 30 years building in Gold Coast and Western Sydney. I think it's a necessity. There's going to be growing pains. I don't mind financially the AFL doing what they need to do to keep those 2 clubs going. And I don't mind it coming necessarily out of the pockets of the other 16 clubs either. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Tasmania as well, I think that will be a necessary evil. But that's where stuff like your TV deal, your bargaining agreements, those type of things come in, because you can find a balance. But then we get into the Victorian clubs. And you've got St Kilda, North Melbourne, the Western Bulldogs, all raising under $27 million in revenue outside of pokies in 2023, which is dangerously close to being a third of that the West Coast raised in that same period. Now, to me, this is where my tolerance and patience for AFL funding towards teams starts to get very, very worn. I would be really concerned, given the balance sheets of St Kilda and the Dogs respectively, specifically, I'd be quite concerned if there was to be more handouts coming their way, especially when I don't necessarily agree with the narrative being we need to go up to 20. I think the conversation honestly needs to be had, is 18 the right number?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that Tasmania coming in and making it 19 would require a loss of a slot somewhere, whether that's abolition or emerging. And before the keyboards start typing, I know nobody wants to hear, I want your club to fold. That makes people very upset. It would make me very upset talking about Fremantle.
Mm.
But I think there also needs to be an understanding here that this isn't a new novel concept. Richmond have almost gone under multiple times. Melbourne and Hawthorn were meant to merge in the 90s. Fitzroy and North Melbourne were meant to merge in the 90s. This isn't new. Those fan bases rallied and fought back, and, full credit to them for doing so.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily know if we can keep doing this forever. And if we want it to be a truly national competition, does having such a presence in Victoria is that actually conducive to that? Especially when these clubs who have had 100 years to establish themselves financially are still having to look and peer over the fence at AFL House and go, "Psst, Andrew, can I have a 20 for the bus?"
Yeah, that's true.
What's your thoughts?
Well, look, and like before we started this, I mentioned that I hadn't actually looked at any of this revenue stuff, but I found it very interesting. And what you just mentioned before in relation to the fan bases rallying is going to happen regardless of how they do this, right? So what happened with the merger for Brisbane and Fitzroy?
So the whole time it was going to be Fitzroy and North. Right. The whole time. And then there was sponsorship from I think Fiji or Papua New Guinea for Fitzroy. It was something really random. Sure. And that had staved off the creditors. And then that kind of went all fine. North turned it around on field. I think they made a prelim in 94. They won in 96. But they turned it around on field and kind of got themselves going. They had Wayne Carey, Corey McKernan. They had a really strong team at that point in time. Mm. Things didn't turn for Fitzroy, and Brisbane desperately needed help that the AFL didn't have the money to give them. So the merger became essentially the only option for those two clubs. It became a marriage of necessity.
So you've got a Melbourne team and an outside Melbourne team merging together. Are people in Melbourne too proud to see their teams merge together? Is that going to be the biggest issue, and why? Because the fact that they're still having to be propped up by the AFL a little bit after all this time. You're right, is fine. But is that also a symptom of the AFL just kind of going, no stress, guys, don't worry about it. We've got you. Regardless of what happens, we've got you. Should there be a little less hand-holding potentially for these teams to be like, right, you got to do it on your own, otherwise a bit more firm action. Do it by yourself. If you can't do it by yourself, then unfortunately you're going to have to come together, pull your money, and form a team together. It's just how it's going to be. Or is it going to be more hand-holding? Is this what's caused where we are now?
I think that's a part of it. And I also want to point out what was happening in the early to mid-90s, and that was a massive recession, which greatly affected the pockets of supporters and people who wanted to go to the games. Now, this is not the Jesse and Liam Economic Forum podcast, but I don't think it takes a Harvard level maths genius to look out the window and say, oh no, my paycheck's not going as far as it would have 2 years ago for a number of reasons. So that becomes another problem too. If the fan base wants to rally behind a club financially but can't, is that a failure of the AFL or a failure of the clubs? I think in many ways it's both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hard to argue. So that's the big question then, Jesse. Which two teams are you merging?
It's very hard.
I know that's very loaded. That is very loaded. I'm sorry.
Honestly, I would merge North and Tasmania. The historical connection is there. Again, North, I'm sorry. I'm not just dumping on you because you're last. The revenue is not there as well. And, we've been down this road before. Now, that's not to say that North won't turn it around financially and on the field. I mean, to be fair, financially they're doing pretty well because they do a lot of things within their means. And and that is, completely valid. But I don't think necessarily we need to just be discounting 18 teams as a legitimate option because I don't want 19, but I'm also not necessarily sure I want 20.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is going to, again, within a decade and a half of 2 expansion teams coming in and disrupting the talent pools, it's going to happen again. Especially now, given that Western Sydney and Gold Coast, let's say medium-sized markets. Tasmania and Darwin seem to be the front runner, so we'll throw in them too. They are small markets. They are proud footballing state and territories and cities within themselves, but they are small markets. And I think, and I want to talk about this more later on, but I think there's better ways to service these markets and these areas than just half-assing a team in there, propping them up with concessions, and then realizing 10 years later, oh shit, no one wants to live in Hobart in the middle of July when they're 19 and could be getting paid $400,000 to go and do it on the Gold Coast, in lovely Melbourne with all the fashion and coffee, or in sunny Perth.
Yeah. The drives on the weekend just don't cut it, hey, Jesse. Down in lovely Tassie. You don't want to go for a drive.
Cover the whole state with that
now. No, very windy roads, man. Very mountainous, very hilly, very windy. Very windy. It takes some time. But no, I mean, look, we'll move on because obviously I know this is it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I think we'll get a magnifying glass further on it in the next few years. I would assume, given that you can't have such a disparity between the top and the bottom, especially when trying to bring in all these new teams, more money, more stuff. Like you've just said it all anyway. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's definitely something that we have to talk about more in the future. I'm sure you'll have more to say about it. Is that right, Jesse? I'm sure you will. Yes, you will.
It is. And end of financial year is this month, which means we should be getting annual reports filter through in the coming months after that. So that is something that I will save you the tedium of reading, Liam, and present my findings with my own perspectives and biased on the Dodgy Punts AFL podcast as is tradition.
Thank you. And I appreciate that because some of these things, they're really interesting to hear you talk about, but then you ask me for my opinion. I'm like, yes, I have an opinion on it. Yes.
What you said.
What you said, Jesse.